Okay, welcome to our webinar on buying property in Portugal. This is part of our Retire Abroad virtual roadshow. And today we'll aim to give you an idea of some of the issues you consider when buying property in Portugal. I'm Nigel Ayres, I run Expat Network. I've lived in Hong Kong, Malaysia, and the US during my career, and lived in Spain for the last 3.5 years. We're joined by Luis de Silva, who runs Algarve Senior Living, Property Finders Portugal, and a number of other brands. So before we start, just to repeat what I normally say, and that is, we're here to answer your questions. If you have any questions, just use the button on your screen. We'll answer all that we can during the webinar, and any that we don't cover, we'll answer by email after the webinar. If you need to send us any questions after the event, then just send it to expats@expatnetwork.com. Okay, perhaps if we could start, Lewis, by telling us a bit about yourself and your business and the areas that you cover. Sorry, I'm muted. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, welcome everyone, and good afternoon. Yes, so after a sort of fairly long stint in the sort of corporate world where I ran businesses in different parts of the world, I lived in 10 countries, or have lived in 10 countries, a couple of double stints in a few of them. We realized that one of the issues confronting people in a country move was the need for assistance in all sorts of areas in terms of helping them make that change. And having been through the challenges ourselves, we thought, well, it makes business sense to set something up that assists people in doing so. So our business was set up with a view to assisting people who were looking to primarily and initially retire to Iberia. Our main market is Portugal, although we do work in Spain as well. And as part of that process, the accommodation element was crucial, and is crucial. And so we work extensively across a whole range of disciplines, in helping people sort of identify the country and the region and then moving there. But specifically, we work across the rentals and the property sales, where we work with a whole range of local partners. So we act as the property finder rather than a traditional listing agent. And the reason for this is because we get inquiries from all around the world, for all different areas of the country, and it is practically impossible to become or to be an agent that covers listings everywhere in the country. You'll find that listing agents normally have a focus on a particular area. So we took a different view. We very much work with the buyer or the renter, the tenant, and therefore we have access to all these properties through relationships and through agreements we've put in place over many, many years, which means that we have access to these properties. So given that this is the presentation on the property element of things, I think our focus and the message I want to send out is that we're an excellent route into the market, because the property portals and other sources are not always 100% reliable. So we add the human element to the search for suitable properties. And that's what we do primarily around the accommodation and the real estate element.
Okay, thanks, Lewis. So how does finding a property in Portugal sort of vary from the UK? I mean, traditionally in the UK, people will be familiar with estate agents, and they just go along and find their property there. But how does it differ in Portugal?
Yeah, so some similarities and some differences. So in the UK, for example, you employ, if you will, two different things. One is you employ a lot of the portals, the Zooplas, the Rightmoves, and so on, to sort of do your initial search. And that often is similar to Portugal. You use a couple of the large portals like the Idealistas, the Green Acres, and so on, to get a sense of what's available. And then you will go into a local agent. And in the UK, that's normally easier to do. You have maybe half a dozen main agents per area or per town, and they tend to cover that location very well. And you know that they will have, shall we say, most of the product available, and you go there and you sort of inquire, and you manage half a dozen maximum relationships. In Portugal, it's different. It's different for a few reasons. The first is that the product is much more spread out among different agencies. So you could have several dozen agencies working in a certain space, and some of those actually sharing the same product. So there's hardly ever anymore an exclusive listing. And multiple listings. So one agency will have multiple products, and other agents will have some of those products but not others. So if you work by yourself and you're contacting all these agents, it's very hard work, because you will have to navigate the different portals. Often the information is not correct, it's not updated, it's outdated. You'll find that stuff has already been sold or been rented and is still listed. You will then have to contact the different individual agencies, and the same problem will occur. Some will not get back to you, some will be slow, some don't speak English as well. Anyway, the whole range of challenges that you find. So you can adopt that route, which is what many people still do. But then you have to be very good at managing multiple communications, especially who you've talked to about what, because we get a lot of inquiries of people who clearly have been around the market and they can't even remember what property they're inquiring about, because they're totally confused. They don't know who you are. They're confusing you with a conversation they've had with someone else. So it becomes chaotic. So in the UK, we don't have a multiple listing system like we have in the US or in Canada. So there's also no central database, but it tends to be quite local, and you know who to speak to. In Portugal, Spain, that's a bit more difficult. So our approach is different, because we basically, clients work through us and we do all that hard work behind the scenes. It doesn't mean that people can't help us by identifying properties that they've seen and put them through to us, and we'll check them out, but it simplifies the interface and makes it a lot easier. And the other thing is that what you find is, to talk openly about commission levels in the UK, they tend to be around 1%. So what you find is that you'll either have exclusives with the listing agency, or people will, or they will show you the product because they have the listings, and you will go and visit that product, and that's it alone. They will not go out and hunt and go and try and collaborate with someone else to sort of find you a property. They'll show you what they have, and if they don't, that's it. You've got to go and look with someone else. In Portugal, it's not the case. People will go and share and look between agencies. And so that creates a complexity. And of course, the commission, which is higher, typically 4 to 6%, plus VAT, is shared between different agencies. You, as a buyer, do not want to necessarily have the hassle of having to manage this whole sort of multi-agency pipeline. And so working with a finder, that simplifies that, because behind the scenes, the commission is shared between however many people are involved in the transaction. So it's just a slightly different approach. Final point that I would make is, if you do not know where you will settle in a country, then look at it from the selling agent's perspective. If you're thinking, well, I might look in, let's say, using the Portuguese example, in Porto, Lisbon, and the Algarve, or the Silver Coast and the Algarve, a more likely scenario. Only one person is going to get your business, because if you're still looking around in different locations, only one person is actually going to sell you a property or rent you a property. They're not very motivated, especially in rentals, if you are not yet decided on where you're going to go. And therefore, put yourself in the shoes of the person on the other side. They're not necessarily going to be very helpful if you're still telling them that you're looking around in different locations and talking to 50 people. Why should they spend their time? They're not going to make any returns on that. So using a finder actually reduces that, because we pick up the slack and we manage the message, and we don't necessarily go out to 50 people. We will take your requirements and only go out to maybe 1 or 2 in a certain area, and then qualify the properties with you, thus saving both sides time and effort. So these are nuances which are not always evident, when you look at the different markets.
Okay, thank you. Just an update on the market. Obviously, Brexit and then the pandemic has sort of impacted things. How is the market currently, and what do you expect to see over the coming months?
Okay, so Portugal has been one of the standout performers in the positive sense of the word over the last, I would say, from late 2014 or so. So we're looking at 8 years of solid growth. Some people talk about, possible bubble, and prices coming down and so on, but they've been saying this. In fact, I was one of those people some years ago that used to say they've been proved wrong every time. And the reason that this is not yet, that there hasn't been an issue and a tick down in prices, is because there continues to be a huge difference between supply and demand. Portugal has been so attractive for so many people as a retirement destination, for the reasons we've discussed in other presentations, that the demand for property, especially in the more popular coastal areas, far exceeds supply. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't properties for sale. There are, but the type of properties that an expat buyer or a foreign buyer searches for, with certain types of conditions, modern, refurbished perhaps, with not requiring much work, that pool of properties is lower and smaller. And therefore, the demand has been far higher than the supply has been, meaning that properties stay on the market for a very short time, typically weeks or months, I would say, rather than months or years, as was the case beforehand. And the other thing is that we see consistent price growth. So we do not expect this to change. We expect the rate of growth to slow, but the pandemic has actually accelerated the price growth, and especially when people started to travel again, the pent-up demand was just visible. 2022 was the busiest year that most people have had in many years, because all the people that could not travel in 2020 and 21 and wanted to actually purchase but needed to see first did all that traveling in 2022. So the Portuguese market has continued to grow, both in terms of value, overall value of transactions. The average value per transaction has gone up, and prices have increased significantly, probably in the region of 60 to 100% over the last sort of 5 to 8 years. So a significant increase in price, and we don't expect this to stop.
Okay, thank you, Lewis. Quick question here, going back to the commission. Is 4 to 6% paid by the buyer or the seller?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I always say this. You always, as a buyer, you always pay the commission, because it's your money that's flowing through the transaction and then gets deducted from the transaction at some point in time. Okay, so you, as the buyer, if you're listening to this presentation, will always be responsible for that. Legally, the listing agent will be the person that actually sends the invoice to the seller. Okay. And the seller will then deduct the amount, or will get deducted that amount and pay the listing, pay the sales agent, and that sales agent will then distribute out the money to other agents in the process. So you'll hear a lot of people saying the commission is paid by the seller. Legally and contractually, that's correct, but actually you as the buyer are paying it, because it comes from your money. And so where this comes up with a finder agent is that, and without getting into the different models, sometimes finder agents charge an extra fee, which would be on top of that. Okay, we don't work that way. We literally, we share the commission with the listing agent. We just want sort of an exclusive warranty from the buyer that they will work through us. But the answer is you pay the commission, but it's billed by the listing agent who represents the seller.
Right. Okay. Perhaps it'd be good to look at the property market in Portugal, the attractions of the different regions, properties available, and so on. And I think you have a presentation that will help people see that.
I do. So shall I share my screen, Nigel?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So if I do that, let's just see if it's coming up, and I will.
Yep, that's coming up.
Okay, I'll maximize it just so that. Let me just see if it. Right, are you seeing it on full screen now?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, very good. So just a brief presentation about buying a property in Portugal. And the first question that often people ask is the whole rent versus buy argument and approach in which they should take. And, you know, we've set out a sort of small list of obvious questions that will allow you to decide on which, you know, is best for you. So clearly, if you don't know Portugal well, and you're trialing the lifestyle, then what you want to do is probably rent or rent before buying. Okay, and that would push you to those sort of solutions. If you're a regular visitor to Portugal, you know exactly where you want to be, and you don't want to have any risks with fluctuating rental values, or being able to find a property and then not finding a property, and so on and so forth, then clearly you're a candidate to buy. So if you go through this list of points, if you will, those should help you decide whether you should be looking at renting first, or buying first, or renting and then buying. I'll bring forward a point that actually Nigel was mentioning when we were chatting before the presentation, and that is about care. Clearly, your age will also determine the route that you take. So allowing some flexibility if you are at an advanced age and feel that you may not be independent for much longer, or you think that there's a risk that you may become less independent, then clearly maintaining that flexibility will be important, and opting for a rental solution may well be a route that you will consider rather than a purchase solution, because A, you don't necessarily want to tie up all the equity, but B, reselling a property always takes a bit longer than getting out of a rental. I will go through a couple of the regions. There isn't enough time to go through all of them, but I will talk about a few of the main regions in Portugal. And I do this by comparing a purchase value and a rental value for a typical two-bedroom property. So you will see in Portugal the use of the term T or V before a number, and that means the number of bedrooms in a property. So a T0 will be a studio, and a V4 will be a four-bedroom villa, for example. So we're using the T2 examples. And if I start in the north of the country, which is typically the area around Porto, Braga, Viana do Castelo, and so on, prices in Porto I've been doing these presentations for many years now. So when I talk today, I'm thinking back 10 years, over the last sort of presentations of 10 years, and thinking that prices in Porto are now quite high. You will need to spend around 250,000 euros to get a two-bedroom apartment. There are rents available still from around 800 a month. A property that requires refurbishment will cost you about 225,000. There are some cheaper ones, and there are some 350,000 euro golden visa properties in Porto, for example. The advantage of the north is that the cost of living is actually lower. There are going out and eating at a restaurant, it tends to be cheaper in the north, and in Lisbon or in the south. There's a lot of history and culture. So the larger cities are steeped in culture and history, a lot of concerts, museums, and so on and so forth. It is colder and rainier. We do have 300 days of sunshine in certain parts of the country, but not everywhere. So please be aware that if you are looking to get away from cold and rainy, especially in the winter, the north of the country will not be it. And one thing you should be aware of is there is increasing rental regulation in historical parts of the city, both in Lisbon and in Porto primarily, which means that supply of certain type of product for short-term rentals will be limited, but it should be easier to find longer-term rentals. And in terms of main cities, Porto is still the one where long-term rental accommodation in the sort of historical city center is still reasonably priced. It's not the case in Lisbon anymore, but Porto, one can still find interesting options. The Silver Coast, which is the region between Porto and Lisbon, broadly speaking, not the entire one, but broadly speaking, it's cheaper in many aspects, but not as cheap as it was. again, an area of historical interest. It is windier and the sea is very cold because the wind comes off the Atlantic Ocean directly, and there is a long there are long periods of early morning mist that last sometimes for several hours. So there tends to be a quite humid region, a chilly region. You know, you've got to wear a jumper to make sure that you don't get a chill and that cold. Modern properties can be found from around 220,000 euros. Traditional properties are a lot cheaper. They don't come necessarily with the same location, but there is a big price difference. And the rentals are not as cheap as they used to be in the past. 750 euros per month is about the starting point. We then go to the greater Lisbon area, and then you'll find that there are three sort of distinct areas. Lisbon itself, where there was a trend in purchasing historical property. It's an area where you need to move quickly. Property gets rented or gets sold in days or weeks, and certainly not more. So if you want to buy or rent something in Lisbon, you've got to be able to take a decision very, very quickly. Prices continue to rise, you know, and they tend to be, you can't get a 2-bedroom for less than 300,000, generally speaking, and the rent's around 1,500 a month on average. I'm not saying these are general numbers, so I'm not saying you won't be able to find something cheaper or a lot more expensive. I'm talking sort of average general entry-level values for that sort of type of property. We then have the Cascais and Estoril area. They're kind of 30 kilometers west of Lisbon, very upmarket, cosmopolitan. There's an existing expat community. It's become quite expensive for sales and rentals. So I would say actually slightly higher than Lisbon on average for the sale. Although the rentals come at slightly cheaper value, maybe 1,350 to find a 2-bedroom with no sea view for that in the Cascais area. And then you have the Linha, which is the sort of area between Lisbon and the Cascais-Estoril area, and those prices are going up fast because people have discovered that Lisbon and Cascais are becoming very expensive, and so they're sort of opting for this area between the two. And so realistically, 225,000, you won't get much change out of that, and you'll have to look quite hard for that. And then 900 euros a month is kind of realistic minimum for a rental. And then hopping down to the Algarve area, it continues to be a top tourist destination. Highest number of inquiries by foreign buyers and by quite some way. This is where all the sunshine really is, and it does last all year round. 175,000 as an entry level for a 2-bedroom property, and even then it'll be quite scarce. 200,000 perhaps is a bit more realistic. 900 euros a month. We have a few available at that level. Probably you're now looking at over 1,000 euros on average for an annual rental. And importantly, in the Algarve and the Silver Coast, those two regions, knowing when to start a rental is crucial, because people asking to start a long-term rental in or around the summer are just likely to be very disappointed, because no one's going to risk starting an annual let, for example, in May, June, July, August, that sort of period of time. You have to wait until after the summer. Final recommendation: don't expect a premium location and expect a sort of discounted price. These are premium locations that are charging premium prices. A bit of insight into the Silver Coast, which is the area, sort of broadly speaking, between Nazaré and then sort of south of Peniche, Lourinhã, and so on, and to Torres Vedras. This has become quite popular, especially with Brits who feel that the Algarve may become too touristic, although the towns on the Silver Coast are just as touristic as those in the Algarve, and actually feel even more touristic because they're smaller. And so in the summer, they tend to swell up more with visitors. So be aware of the perception and reality. If you're living slightly inland in a place called, like Alcobaça or Caldas da Rainha, Bombarral, for example, even Lourinhã, which is on the coast but slightly further south, that's fine. You maybe will not get the swell of foreign visitors, but anything like Nazaré, São Martinho do Porto, Peniche, those sort of things, Foz do Areio, these are all tourist destinations. In the summer they swell up. There's some very traditional towns. The coastline is world famous for these large waves, these record-beating waves out of Nazaré and so on. But it does mean that you get this onshore wind, which makes it pretty chilly for a lot of the year, and a lot of sort of chilly, cold, and fog. So be aware, especially as some of the Portuguese properties are not that well insulated. You do need to make sure that you're not finding yourself in a sort of a poorly insulated property that is very cold. It is more authentic because there are more historical towns and villages in the area. English may not be as well spoken inland, although English is generally well spoken by many people across Portugal. It's probably one of the southern European countries that speaks the best level of English as a second language. And in fact, the Portuguese is known as a population that are the seventh best non-native English speakers in the world. So very good degree of English spoken for someone for a country whose first language is not English. Well known for its gastronomy, so the food is fantastic, and there's a variety of it. And property prices have risen significantly in this area, especially new build has grown a lot. To come back to the sort of greater Lisbon area, it's a great destination and has been very popular with sort of weekend and short stay breakaways. So conferences, cruises stop there, weekend breakaways, but not the sort of hen and party type a crowd that goes there. It's a more sophisticated crowd. They tend to go there for sort of cultural weekend, just for a short city break, as they would go to another European city like maybe Prague or Paris or whatever. And Lisbon has been very popular. It's a mix of historical and traditional and modern real estate options. So you'll find both. English is very widely spoken. It's an existing expat destination. There's a whole range of different things you can do, both culturally, gastronomically, touristically, huge variety of things in a fairly small area, which makes it a great choice for people to visit both short and longer periods of time. And it's gone through huge redevelopment as a result of some of these investment programs, and as a result, this has meant that the prices have grown substantially over the years. It's expensive. Lisbon is an expensive city in which to buy at the moment. It's clearly not expensive as Paris, for example, although there's some houses that cost the same per square meter. But it's an expensive city, especially when you compare to the local salaries and the local buying power. Even though, and I should caveat this, 80 to 90% of all purchases in Portugal continue to be done by the Portuguese. So the foreign market is not it represents around 12%, I believe it is, but I could be wrong on that number, of overall sales. So the Portuguese are still buying, but they're having to buy a different type of product. The high-end product, the luxury product, is being a bigger percentage of that is being bought by foreign people. And then it's the best location for healthcare choices, because a lot of the bigger hospitals, private hospitals and so on, are located in Lisbon. Why the Algarve? For all the reasons that most of you probably know already. Best place in the world to retire. I say 8 years in a row. I think it's 10 years in a row now. It is a wonderful place to retire because it's got the combination of the weather, the outdoor activities, the cost of living. The type of real estate is very appealing, attractive. Vistas of the coastline in many instances, or access to the coastline. So these are things that adds to the quality of life of a lot of people. The Portuguese are the largest fish eaters per capita in Europe, and in the Algarve there's a huge variety of fish available, often very fresh and caught locally. So that's a standout aspect of the Algarve as such. It still, in my opinion, still offers the best balance of quality of real estate versus price. I'm not saying that it's not a lot more expensive than it was some years ago, but if you want a 3-bedroom villa in the Algarve with a sea view, you might spend 600,000 to €1 million. That's not cheap anymore, but you'd pay 2.5 million to maybe 3 million in Lisbon for that, and you'd pay the same price probably in the Silver Coast, and which doesn't have the same ability to attract sort of off-season tourism and the kind of tourism rates if you want to rent it out when you're not there. So you just need to think through these things. Price is a lot higher, but the value for money is still very good. There are, interestingly enough, a couple of coastal areas on the Algarve that still qualify for the residential a golden visa, which is the one that I mentioned in previous presentations, had changed, and residential was disqualified in high density areas. People don't know that in the Algarve there are two southern coastal municipalities that are low density and that still qualify at the reduced level of 400,000 euros. So you need to spend 400,000 euros and get a residential property. And then the other thing that shouldn't be underestimated, especially if you're coming from the UK, is Faro is by far the best destination in terms of connectivity to the UK. There are 3 airports in Southern Europe that offer this advantage, and Faro is one of them. So if you're coming from the UK, in terms of access back to the UK, without a shadow of a doubt, Faro is the number 1. Lisbon is second. Lisbon is number 1 in terms of intercontinental. Real estate purchasing and ongoing costs. I think I've mentioned this before. Between 5 and 8% of purchase price is what you should expect. So count on 8 as the upper end, and that will be a good indicative value of the amount that you will pay as an extra. And this is, of the popular European destinations, Portugal is the lowest in terms of purchase cost. Spain has the VAT. France, even the notaire costs are pretty much this level. So as a general rule, the closing costs in Portugal are the lowest in the most popular market. That is comprised of a transfer tax, which is 0 to 8%, and land is fixed at 6%, and properties above 1 million at 7.5%. Stamp duty at 0.8%. And legals are typically 1% plus VAT. Incidentals, including the notary, who doesn't have as an important a role as the lawyer in a transaction, around 500. And then on an annual cost basis, you'll be paying things such as the municipal tax, insurance, a condominium fee if you're on a condominium, and mortgage costs where applicable. So excluding the mortgage costs, you could be looking at anywhere between 1,000 and a few thousand euros if you have condominium fees per property. Then a little bit about us. These are our brands. When Nigel talks about the brands, we have several because we've set up the business to be able to help people across different, not only countries, but also areas of their process. So we have some brands that are focused on the UK, where we do work. We then have brands focused on Portugal. We have brand focused on Spain. And then in relation to Portugal itself, we have a website which is which connects people to different partners in terms of their D7 visa, helping with anything from the actual visa process to setting up a bank account and NIF. And we work directly with the banks and with people who do the NIF provision and so on and so forth. We have Property Finder, which is our property finding service. We have Algarve Long Lets, which is the largest medium and long-term rental portfolio in the south of the country, and we'll be replicating that to a few other areas in due course. And then we're also involved with an independent living development that will hopefully get started in due course for the independent living market. We've been in the market for just under a decade. We work with clients from around 30 countries, although we get inquiries from around 100 countries, people actually looking and comparing different countries who end up not going to Portugal and so on. And we try to respond to everyone initially, no costs involved. We're trying to help people make the correct decision. So we don't take a paid consultancy type approach. Obviously, we do ask people to be cognizant that, time is money, and therefore we don't act as a lifeline and long exchanges and as an information point for the country, unless we feel that people are really serious and then moving ahead. So reasonableness is what we ask of people when they get in touch with us, because we do get hundreds of inquiries every month, and those are some of our websites and contacts. But you can, in emailing Nigel, you give contact to us, so feel free to do so. And email Nigel if you need any help from us. So I will stop sharing my screen now, and that will take us back to Nigel.
Many thanks, Lewis. I think that people retiring abroad, the first stage is that sort of active, outdoor lifestyle and so on, and the enjoyment of a new climate, a new lifestyle, a new sort of way of life.
Yeah.
However, I think we all have to face the fact that at some point health may not continue, and we then get to the need for care. And you touched on this during your presentation. Essentially, some people will return to the UK at that point, I believe. But what are the sort of provisions in Portugal that people could have that if they need to get that care later in life?
Yeah. Okay. So it's actually I'm glad you asked the question, and it's so pertinent, because even if you are independent, and you'll find that I'm somebody who's quite openly sort of abrupt about this. I think people should talk about this subject and not sort of fool themselves that, oh, I'm independent and I don't need any help or any care. You may not today, but as you say, just an accident, and that I had an accident with my left arm and I had a multiple fracture, and even though I'm active again, but the limitations I felt just on that small accident, if I'd been 30 years older, it would have completely changed my life, and it could have happened from one moment to the other. So I think we with no disrespect to anyone, we prefer people who are open and in talking and dealing with this, and we often have to explain to people the difference between independent living, which is when you still are independent, assisted living, which is where you need some help, and care, which is where then you really cannot live yourself by yourself without sort of permanent assistance. Now, there's a good and a bad side. The goods, the start with the bad and then end with the good. The bad side is that there are very few sort of truly professionally run options in Portugal, on a sort of medium to large assisted living, care home, even independent living options are very, very scarce. It hasn't been a sector of the market that has taken off, and we're constantly surprised, which is one of the reasons why we're trying to develop the Luge Living project. It'll be an independent living project for people who want to enjoy the lifestyle and so on, but we'll be going to be building it in a fully accessible fashion, so that we can add services to it later as people age. So to allow people to actually age and not have to then move physically from their home, which has too many stairs or whatever. And this is a problem which occurs in the UK and in other countries already. So it's not a new challenge. So what we say is try to look for a purpose-built, or as close as you can, purpose-built property when you are independent. And that means looking at details such as ramps and elevators in buildings and so on. You may love, the style of a traditional property in the center of Lisbon, which is over 3 floors. And then suddenly you get to 70 and you can't climb stairs anymore. And then you have to move. And it's not only about the moving, it's the fact that you have all your social network has now been set up in that area, and you're thinking of relocating, for example, back to the UK, but your children have moved on to other areas. Your social circle of friends has changed. Some of them have moved or gone, or their health. So you need to think about whether or not you will remain in the country. And what we are seeing is less and less people moving back to the UK for reasons of healthcare alone. Okay, and the reason for that is a number of them. One is that the NHS itself is suffering some difficult challenges, not different to the national health system in Portugal. The second is that care in Portugal is as good as it is in the UK. It just operates in a slightly different way, but actually not that differently to the NHS. And the third is that care in Portugal is much, much cheaper than it is in the UK. So what we are seeing is people who become or reach a certain age, their children are actually looking for solutions in Portugal to allow their parents to remain in Portugal, in care in Portugal, which is a lot cheaper than funding their care in the UK. Okay, so briefly how it exists: we have independent living, very few of them. They tend to be around the Greater Lisbon, the Greater Porto area. They tend to be independent living, slightly in some cases assisted living, they're expensive. They're purpose-built facilities with a sort of, it's a bit like the McCarthy's and Stone of the UK type of thing, with a bit more assistance at the entrance and at the sort of reception level, and a picking list of services, including medical services, which people can buy. There's that, but it's expensive. Okay. And then we have the care home. Typically, there are small sort of family-run care homes of anything between 10 and 25 beds, and they tend to be sort of in converted houses and so on. The quality of care varies. Quite humane interaction with people, but not much stimulus. So you'll find a lot of people sort of sitting in lounges watching television, and no one's doing much stuff to sort of get these people out. We do work with care homes that have a more sophisticated model, but they're very limited and they're not expensive. You know, a fully dependent person would pay maybe 2,200 euros a month on a fully inclusive basis. So that's the accommodation, the medical care, or a lot of it, the meals, and so on. So 2,200 euros would be the top end. If you're still independent, you might be paying anything around 1,400, 1,500 euros a month, fully inclusive.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to mortgages. Many people will be financing their purchase from savings from the sale of their UK property, or indeed a remortgage of their UK property if they have decided to hold on to it and rent it out or whatever. But some people do still require mortgages even when they're coming to retire. And I believe quite often that's relatively small amounts, but sometimes higher. So how easy is it to get a mortgage in Portugal?
Yeah, it's very, generally speaking, I would say very easy, very open market. We often refer clients over to a mortgage broker, and what they do is they will look at the different banks and what the different banks have available as a mortgage product. It's a very simple rule. It's based on affordability. So in other words, does the bank think that you can afford to repay the mortgage? And they will typically consider up to 33% of your disposable income as the maximum that they consider as reasonable. On that, you'll obviously have to declare what other outgoings you have, but it's the amount you have available. 33% of that, they would say that it is a fair risk for the bank to take in terms of money that you can set aside and pay, because the rest of the stuff the rest of your money you need to live on, and that will determine how much you can afford to borrow. Loan to value typically 70%, sometimes 80%, and in one or two cases even 90%, but 70 is pretty standard. Also, I was going to make another point and it's just suddenly gone.
What about the age that people...
Oh, yes, exactly. That was it. Thank you. It was the age. Absolutely crucial. So 65 and 75 are key dates. At 65 or before 65, you're treated pretty much the same as anyone else. Okay. In other words, you have access to all the products, because typically banks do not like to lend beyond about 75 or 80 in some cases. So at 65, you still have 10, sometimes 15 years of a mortgage product that you made available. 75, they definitely don't want to lend beyond 75 in most instances. And one of the reasons for this is that at these ages, it used to be at all ages, but now the rules have changed slightly, but they ask for life insurance as well, okay, because they want to make sure that the bank is covered should you pass away. And clearly, you know, as we get older, the likelihood of us dying is greater, for obvious reasons. And the problem is you can then not find the right sort of product, insurance product to back up the mortgage, okay? And that's one of the key challenges. Is it's not just about the mortgage, it's about the insurance that is compulsory in many instances, and that must accompany the mortgage. So 65, 75 are key ages. And the other thing is that we see a lot of people doing is either doing a bridging loan, let's say for 10 years, just to tie them over and have a bit of a small mortgage. We also see if there's a difference in the ages of the couple, then we see the younger person rather applying for the mortgage. and the older person acting as a guarantor. And then we have another situation, which is if you have children, you get the children to ask for the mortgage, put it in the name of the children, and then you have a contract that basically says that you have the right to use the house or whatever, and you set that up.
Okay. And so when getting a mortgage, is it easy to go direct to the banks yourself, or would you generally suggest a broker is worth using?
Yeah, we will suggest a broker because they get paid by the bank. Again, it'll come out of you'll pay for it in the end because it's your money, circulating back to them. But it's the same old thing about the real estate commission. They get paid by the bank with your money, and they get paid a small percentage, sort of less than 1% of the transaction cost, 0.5, whatever it is. Can't remember what it is. But it's worth it because they will scan the market for all the options, and especially if you're somebody who's recently arrived permanently into Portugal, you may even know the country well, but you haven't got a banking relationship and so on. It's not to say that your bank has the best option. So actually what will happen is, because to have a mortgage, you need to have an account at that bank. It's actually, if you're going to find a mortgage, use a mortgage broker. They will find the best option, and you will find them then that is the bank at which you will open your bank account, because you'll logically need a bank account to service your mortgage and payments.
Yep. And when you're buying property, it's generally very important, if you need a mortgage, to know how much you can get. Is approval in principle a fairly standard approach in Portugal? So you've gone.
Hello?
Sorry, we lost your sound briefly there.
Okay, sorry, I just muted just in case there's a bit of background noise. So the approval in principle is not. I want to make the distinction clear. Approval in principle is not common because the bank must have an asset to make you a formal offer. But what you can do, and this happens all the time, is an indicative amount of what you can borrow. And there, a mortgage broker will be fundamental because they will scan the market and will give you that sort of soft pre-approval, if you will, which doesn't involve any formal approval from any bank. So it's not a pre-approval, and you can't go out to the market with the knowledge that you have the mortgage, but you will have an idea of what you can actually spend, because the mortgage broker, for example, will have talked to the banks about your personal circumstance, and they will have a very strong indication that that bank can provide that sort of lending.
Yeah. Again, another factor in buying a property abroad, obviously, is the foreign exchange risk. And if you're buying a property, the time you establish you want the property, the price and so on, between that and the time that you actually pay for it, it's quite possible that the exchange rate will shift, giving an enormous, well, not enormous always, but potential risk of finding that you've got in sterling terms a much higher amount to pay. What I would just say is that currency specialists are by far the best option rather than banks, because both in terms of managing that risk and in terms of sending the money over, banks tend to have a larger spread on the exchange rate. They also tend to charge much higher fees and so on. So when you're making a major purchase, such as buying a property, then that becomes quite a significant sum of money. The other side of it, of course, is then on an ongoing basis, if you're funding it from UK income into Portugal, then again, you've got that exchange rate and you need a regular money transmission arrangement. Again, I'm not sort of, getting any kickbacks for saying so, but the currency providers definitely provide a better service. I don't know whether there's anything you'd add on the foreign exchange side, Lewis. Sorry, you're silent again. I don't know why.
Sorry, I mute myself when I'm not speaking. It just takes a bit of time. I think I'm back now. Yeah, I would just reinforce what you've said, Nigel, which is absolutely correct. And in fact, I would say it's the first thing that I would do in any country. If you're thinking of moving overseas and you don't even know where you're going yet, get your Forex provider or partner sorted out. There are some online providers, there are some sort of larger firms and whatever. And give you the example of the US. Okay, people who've taken our advice in regards to Portugal, Spain, or whatever, the euro was at kind of, let's call it 120 against the dollar, maybe a year and a half ago. it then went to parity against the euro. The dollar went to parity against the euro. So that's a 20% movement there. And it's now the euro is again at whatever it is, 16, 115 or whatever it is, or 13 against the dollar. So that's another 13% movement. If you had been, you can see how Forex people make their money. That's a 33% return if you'd got the timing perfect. Okay. And that to you as a buyer is a 33% potential movement one way and then the other, and it could go against you. So be aware of the fact that you can also do things like purchase forward currency. So if you feel or you know that the currency is in a good place and your currency happens to be worth more, you can actually buy forward currency to protect you against future currency fluctuations. Very important.
Yeah, indeed. So let's move on to the buying process. Having found property, obtained your mortgage, all ready to go, what happens next?
Okay, so searching for a property is absolutely crucial. And with the due consideration for this mortgage thing, this mortgage process, which actually will only be finalized, just to reiterate, once you actually know the property. But searching for a property is crucial, and it's always location before property. Okay, so we're not only talking about conceptually whether you've decided on, in this case, Portugal, but also a region within Portugal and even a town within the region. So before you start looking, please work with a company or do it yourself, doesn't matter, to narrow down the scope of the location. You then will go into visiting properties. So you will work with someone or with multiple people, and you will find a short list or a long list, and you narrow that down to a short list of properties. You will do the visits. You will like one or other property, and you will want to start making an offer. You will make an offer via the agent with whom you are working, whether it's a buyer agent or a selling agent. You will make an offer. That offer will go with the terms associated with that offer. So in other words, if it's subject to a mortgage, if you wanted to include all the furniture, whatever, if there happens to be something wrong with the house, that the owner fixed the problems in the house, whatever, you make this offer subject to all those conditions via the agent, and you will commence a process of negotiation. Okay. Hopefully out the other end will come an agreement, okay, which will be documented via a series of emails. At the end of that process, and when you have an agreement, you will in some instances pay a small reservation amount. We don't encourage that, and wherever possible, we suggest going straight to a promissory contract. Okay, and the promissory contract is the piece of paper, the document that obligates both you and the seller to completing the transaction. Okay, the reservation has no legal value, really. It's just for the listing agent to remove it from the site, and no more visits, sort of hopefully not happening. So promissory contract normally takes the lawyers around a week to 2 weeks to get the promissory contract agreed and signed by yourself and the selling party. And in this case, you don't need to be there. You should have granted a lawyer a power of attorney to allow them to act and to do this on your behalf. Okay, you then sign the promissory contract. Typically you would pay 10% of the amount, and up to 20% if you're asking for special terms, for example, a long completion date or whatever, or there are certain circumstances. In Portugal, the law is that if you decide, after signing the promissory contract, unless it's for a condition stated specifically in the promissory contract that you no longer to wish to go ahead, you will lose your 10%. If the seller decides not to go ahead, they have to pay you double. So they have to pay you 20%, for example, if they give up. Then there will be the period of sort of sorting out the paperwork by the lawyer, booking the notary appointment and whatever. Typically would take anything up to 3 months, especially if you have a mortgage, but you can complete the entire process. We've done things in 3 weeks, and we've done things in 3 months. Okay, and at completion, you then have the final check on all the documentation, the payment of the remaining amount, and then the property ownership will transfer once your lawyer has then registered the property in your name at the central registrar. Okay, and that's broadly speaking the process.
Right. And you mentioned power of attorney. Some people are quite nervous about power of attorney. What would your comment be on that?
Yeah, don't be. I mean, it's an essential thing. So unless you're going to do, let's be clear, you do not need to appoint a lawyer to sell or to buy a property in Portugal. However, if you are not Portuguese, and this is especially if it's the first a purchase you're making, a lawyer is an essential element to making sure that you don't run risks. Okay, they will be checking things such as the title, the habitation license, the plans, these sort of things. So practically 99.9% of people who are not Portuguese buying in Portugal use a lawyer. So use a lawyer. And when you use a lawyer, you give them a power of attorney. Otherwise, they can't act for you. So it's like a no-brainer. You can't have a lawyer without a power of attorney unless you're intending to fly back to Portugal every time something needs doing, which is totally impractical. So I'm talking things such as getting your fiscal number, receiving funds from you and making sure that they're paid correctly, registering the property once you've purchased it, going to the municipality on your behalf and asking for any paperwork that's needed. I mean, unless you really want to take on all these tasks yourselves and micromanage the lawyer, you basically give the lawyer the power of attorney to act within the scope of that transaction and that transaction alone. Okay, and you can limit that scope.
Just get my coughing done before unmuting. Sorry about that. Yeah, so is it normal practice to have a survey done when you're buying property in Portugal?
Yeah, the answer generally is no. So I think we covered this in one of the other presentations. So if it's an apartment, forget it. It's not worth it because you have too many common or communal parts. The structure is not owned by you, most of it, because it's part of a larger building. The roof may be communal, nothing to do with it. So apartments, no. I mean, and if you see massive cracks in the walls of a building, you're probably unlikely to buy that place anyway. So generally speaking, apartments, no. For other types of properties, if it's a standalone villa with visible signs of concern, maybe a large crack, a bit of subsidence, an annex that seems separate to the main house, and you're not quite certain, what the foundations are like, then a survey sometimes is instructed. For most people, that is not the case. They will not instruct a survey. And the reason for that are different reasons, but some of those that we see are that it's not very common in Portugal, and therefore there are not that many people specializing in surveys. We have Portuguese engineers that are sort of civil and structural engineers that do this, and we would recommend using them. And then a lot of people, especially from the UK, feel quite comforted by using a RICS surveyor, who has a sort of RICS qualification in the UK. But we always say, and there's nothing to do with their skills, but a buyer beware, and that is that they can lend their expertise, but their insurance is not valid in Portugal. Okay, so really, if something goes wrong and it's found out to be as a result of the survey not have been properly done, there is, as far as I'm aware, no comeback, because they are not. It's just an opinion of somebody who has knowledge, and it can be quite expensive just for an opinion. So what we would say is, if you're using a RICS surveyor whose insurance is not valid, then rather use someone who does a very comprehensive survey, including some elements of invasive surveying, to check the actual sort of, the plumbing, the electrics, the insulation, or whatever. Otherwise, it's just not worth the money.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of questions come in. One goes back to the sort of rental. Is a rent to buy a specific legal / commercial agreement? So obviously we're talking about renting before you buy rather than rent to buy. But is rent to buy a common thing in
Yeah. So two different questions there. Is it a specific legal agreement? The answer is yes. You will set up a rent to buy contract, basically, which is a rental contract that gives you the first option of refusal if you wish to buy the property, and that means that you have to you have to negotiate the price and the conditions in advance. Okay. Now, is it common? The answer is no. Now, this was more common after the crisis of 2008 and 2009, where the market was just totally flat and there were no buyers in the market. And therefore, people were very happy to take a rental, get some income, and then have that person buy the house off them later on if they liked it. Today, the buyers do not want a renter in their property if they want to sell, because it slows down the sales process and the demand is so high. So the concept of a rent before buying, we use the term not in relation to the same property, but in relation to someone who's going to rent first and buy later. But almost always, in fact, 100% of the time in our cases, the rental property and the property that they buy are different, not least of which because the people use rental properties to figure out what they actually want to buy and where they want to buy. So often, more often than not, the rental property is not 100% what they want in some way. Okay, so that's what happens in practice.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. I'm planning to buy a property which I'll spend part of the year in, but I will then potentially let it out of the short-term holiday let. What is the regulatory environment in Portugal for that?
Highly regulated. So if you're doing short-term rentals, you have to register and get a license called a local lodging license, IL. You get a number, it's registered with the local municipality. You then will have, not always, but you may have an inspection in 30 days where they check out the security features. So you've got to have a fire blanket, and all these kind of things. You then also have to register activity. So you become like a sole trader of your property, and you are a business person in Portugal. You have to go to the finance office and open up your activity. I'm literally translating that. So you have to start your activity, which means that you then have to present a tax return every year. The tax on this is quite favorable still. It's around 14%, and if you earn more than 10,000 euros, then you'll have to charge VAT at 6% as well. So between 14 to 20% tax on income. It's quite simple to declare the tax. So that's not a problem. And then you need someone to help you manage the commercial element of that. So finding the tenant, or you may do it yourself using Airbnb, VRBO, whatever. But also you need to set up yourself either with a company or with different individual sort of providers to clean the property, deal with maintenance issues and so on. So in answer to the question, highly regulated environment, both in terms of licensing and in terms of fiscal taxation and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's all the questions we have, I think. So we'll finish there. Thank you all for listening. And I know that many of you are planning your move in the fairly near future, some of you rather more long term. As I've said before, we're here to help you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send them across to us at expats@expatnetwork.com. For those of you who are ready to make the move, you might want to consider one of our discovery tours, which basically give you the opportunity to have a tailored tour. This is not really about going and seeing several different areas of Portugal. It's for when you know where you want to go. And it's about, even if you've been there on holiday, it's very different when you're going to live there long term. And so you might want to know, what's it like out of season? What's the, are there a lot of rentals in the area which might lead to a lot of noise? Is the internet good? All those sort of practical issues. And so what we have is somebody who can take you around, explain the area inside out, show you the different urbanizations and which areas you might want to choose. And that is available to you if that's of value. So you can find that on our website, expatnetwork.com. So thank you all for joining us. Good luck with your move to Portugal, and thank you very much, Lewis.
Thank you very much. Good luck, everyone. How about now?